The biting New York wind whipped at Ethan's worn jacket, making him hunch his shoulders as he approached the imposing glass doors. Inside the Columbia University lobby was a stage for exhibition, a universe of designer coats and carefree laughter that seemed to echo the social distance between him and the rest of the students. He was a ghost, a pale silhouette that moved in the shadows, observing the sparkle that wasn't his, the conversations that didn't include his name. The heavy canvas bag on his shoulder felt like a physical reminder of the chasm, a burden that, in everyone's eyes, tethered him to a world he could never escape. The sound of his footsteps was muffled by the velvet carpet, and the silence that accompanied him was not just the absence of sound, but the absence of belonging. Hunger was a knot in his throat, a familiar sensation he had long learned to ignore, just as he ignored the disdainful glances that followed him. In the cafeteria, he took his tray, his rough hands contrasting with those of his peers, who slid across the screens of the latest smartphones. The air smelled of strong coffee and ambition, and he sat in an isolated corner, the same as always, where the light didn't directly hit him. The simple meal, a sandwich wrapped in paper, seemed like a confession of his poverty, a secret he didn't need to say aloud, for his silence already screamed it. He watched, from a distance, the popular group, led by Liam, who made jokes about a freshman's second-hand clothes. Their laughter was sharp and cruel, a soundtrack that became a part of campus life. Humiliation, for Ethan, was a chain that slowly corroded the soul, not a single event, but a state of being. Each time a classmate scoffed at his torn backpack, or when a girl ignored him as if he were invisible, the pain accumulated not in anger, but in a cold resignation. He no longer felt hurt by every insult. Instead, the pain had transformed into an armor of isolation. The world seemed like a large shop window where he could only watch from the outside, knowing that to belong, he would have to shed this armor and expose himself to a suffering that seemed endless. The clock in his mind was always counting down, not for class, but for the moment he could return to the safety of his small, silent room. There, the cold and emptiness of the campus were replaced by a calm he protected fiercely. It was there, amidst stacked books and scribbled notes, that he allowed himself to be something more than the poor kid. But even this refuge was fragile, a lie that reality would crush at the slightest contact with the outside world. He had no friends, no parties to go to, just the weight of a secret that, while protecting him, condemned him to the deepest of loneliness. One day, as Ethan tried to pass unnoticed down a crowded hallway, an unexpected sound made him stop. It wasn't laughter or an insult, but a muffled cry coming from a janitor's closet. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, was huddled on the floor, her small hands covering her face, her body trembling. She wasn't a student, but the daughter of one of the cleaning staff, and her pain was so pure and unadorned that it shattered Ethan's icy armor. His heart skipped a beat, not from fright, but from recognition. It was a pain he knew intimately, the pain of feeling small, fragile, and invisible in a grand, indifferent world. He knelt slowly, his simple clothes not caring about the dirt on the floor. Without saying a word, he extended his hand to her, a silent offer of comfort that required no explanation. His eyes, which most people found cold, now softened. The little girl raised her head, and her tear-filled eyes met Ethan's. There was no pity in his gaze, just a mutual understanding, a silent recognition of lonely souls. In that moment, the invisible barrier he had built around himself seemed to crumble. She didn't see him as the poor kid, but only as the one person who cared about her pain. She didn't ask for help, nor did she explain why she was crying. Instead, she just pointed to a small cloth doll that lay on the floor, dirty and with one arm hanging by a thread. The doll was the perfect metaphor for the girl's own vulnerability, and the way she looked at it made Ethan understand the object's importance without needing words. The doll wasn't a toy, but a piece of her soul. He picked it up carefully, his calloused fingers mending the arm with surprising precision, as if he had done it before. The girl wiped her tears, and a shy smile appeared on her face. She took a small drawing from her pocket and handed it to him. It was a yellow sun drawn with a crayon, simple, but filled with a light he had missed. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice was like a bell in a silent room. Her gesture of giving something of herself to him was a gift so profound that the impact was almost physical. He had no money to give, no words to comfort, but that drawing was worth more than anything he had ever owned. The interaction was interrupted by the sound of a ringing cell phone, but it wasn't Ethan's. The girl quickly grabbed the doll and ran off, leaving him alone in the hallway. He looked at the drawing of the sun in his hand, his heart beating faster than usual. What had happened in those few minutes had been more real and meaningful than any interaction he had had in months. The girl's presence, with her pain and her kindness, had broken the monotonous rhythm of his loneliness. The crayon sun in the palm of his hand was a secret that only he and the girl shared. He felt an urgency, a need to know who she was, not out of curiosity, but out of a sudden and inexplicable need to protect that fragile light she had given him. The doll, the pain, the drawing. Everything seemed like a piece of a puzzle he didn't know he needed to solve. And as he looked at the drawing, the yellow light seemed brighter than the light of the sun itself, and he knew he could no longer go back to being invisible, not after being seen so purely by someone. The encounter with the little girl was an echo that didn't fade. Ethan tried to go back to his routine, to bury himself in books, in anonymity, but the image of her face and the yellow sun in his pocket followed him. It was as if the tranquility he had built was now full of cracks, through which the emotion, which he had learned to suppress, began to leak. He caught himself looking at the drawing during class, the crayon crumbling slightly, a physical reminder of a connection he didn't want to feel. The world he had created to protect himself was becoming a prison, and the desire to protect the girl was the key to freedom, but also the threat of exposing himself again. One afternoon, passing through the cafeteria, he heard a conversation that made him stop. Liam and his friends, laughing loudly, were talking about the janitor, the girl's father, calling him the ghost of the hallway, which immediately caused him a deep revulsion. Liam's voice, full of mockery, was like an alarm, sounding in Ethan's head. He shouldn't even be here. His job is to clean up trash, not to create trash, one of Liam's friends said, and the phrase hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. Those words weren't just about the janitor, but about everyone who didn't fit in, about himself. He felt a heat rise in his neck, a rage he hadn't allowed himself to feel for a long time. In his mind, the voices mingled. Liam's mockery mixed with the phrases of his father, which he heard as a child. "You need to harden up, son. The world has no time for weaknesses." He tried to stifle his father's voice, but it was persistent, a shadow that followed him. He had hardened up, had become a ghost, but what had it cost him? The memory of his mother, the only person who encouraged him to be kind, appeared in his mind. "Your strength is not in what you have, but in what you are, my son," she used to say, and the phrase, which he tried to forget, now echoed in his mind with a painful clarity. His mother's. The voice, mixed with the rage he felt for Liam and the kindness the girl had shown, created an internal conflict. He knew the right thing to do was to intervene, to defend the girl's father, but his father's voice, the fear of ridicule, and the armor he had worn for so long prevented him. The resistance was physical, as if an invisible hand was pulling him back, forcing him to remain silent, to protect himself. He felt cold sweat run down his back, the battle between what he was and what he had become unfolding within his own body. The sound of laughter and mockery followed him to his room, where he finally allowed himself to break down. He sat on his bed, the drawing of the sun in his hand. He looked at the drawing, and the image of the girl, small and fragile, mixed with his mother's voice and Liam's phrase, was too much to bear. The humiliation was not just his, it was of all the invisibles, and the girl's kindness was a beacon that guided him in a direction he was afraid to follow. He knew he had to do something. The resistance was strong, but the desire to protect the girl was stronger. He knew that if he exposed himself, he could lose everything. He could lose the anonymity, the false security he had built. But looking at the crayon sun, he realized he had already lost everything. He had lost himself. True wealth was not in his possessions, but in his soul, and his soul was hungry for justice and connection. From that moment on, the resistance began to dissipate. The icy armor that protected him began to crack, and he felt the pain not of an insult, but of a new and unknown vulnerability. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew he could no longer remain silent. He had to act, not for revenge, but to reconnect with his own humanity. The decision once made brought an unexpected clarity. Ethan didn't seek out the girl or her father. but rather the roots of that hostility. He began to observe Liam and his group closely, noticing the small cracks in their facade of superiority. He realized that their validation didn't come from merit, but from status, and that their arrogance was just a thin shell that hid a deep insecurity. Ethan became an even more silent shadow, but now with a purpose. His invisibility, once a shield, became a tool for investigation, a microscope that revealed the fragilities of power. He discovered that Liam's family was one of the university's main donors, but that Liam's father, a real estate businessman, was under investigation for questionable financial practices. Ethan's access to the university's records was unlimited, a privilege granted to few, but a privilege he had never used for his own benefit. He used it to find the truth about the janitor, the girl's father, and discovered that he was a loyal and honest employee who had worked at the university for over 20 years. The contrast between Liam's hypocrisy and the janitor's dignity was an emotional trigger for Ethan. With each new discovery, a new memory surfaced. He remembered his own father, a man who worked hard to build an empire but who always taught him to value honesty above profit. He remembered a conversation at a dinner where his father said, "True wealth is the respect you earn, not the money you accumulate." The phrase, which once seemed like a cliché, now took on a new meaning. Respect for Ethan was the only treasure he wanted to protect, and to protect it, he would have to unearth the truth, even if it cost him his own peace. The investigation journey led him to a series of unexpected encounters. He met with an old and perceptive history professor, a woman who knew him only as the silent student. She observed him for a moment, her penetrating eyes assessing him. "You are more than you appear," she said, and the phrase was a silent confirmation of his struggle. He asked her for help accessing old university archives, and she, without hesitation, gave him the keys to a file that no one else used, a dusty place, but full of secrets. In that file he found a sponsorship letter, signed by his own father, addressed to the janitor, offering him a scholarship for his son, who was interested in studying engineering. The letter, which was stored in a sealed envelope, was a silent proof of his father's kindness, a kindness he never demonstrated openly, but which he expressed in his actions. Ethan's heart beat faster. He had judged his father for his coldness, but the letter was proof that his kindness was an underground river, silent but deep. He discovered that the girl's father had received the scholarship, but he had refused it to take care of his daughter, who had a serious illness. The discovery was a shock for Ethan. He had focused on Liam's arrogance, but the truth was that the pain of the girl and her father was much deeper than he imagined. The investigation journey, which began as a quest for justice, became a quest for empathy. He wasn't just fighting for himself, but for the dignity of that family, a family that, like his own, had a history of pain and sacrifice. The knowledge he had now was a powerful weapon, but he refused to use it to humiliate Liam. Revenge, he realized, was not what he was after. He was after justice, and justice, for him, was not about exposing Liam's weakness, but about honoring the strength of the janitor and his daughter. He had the power to destroy Liam's reputation, but what would that bring him? Loneliness, the same loneliness he had struggled to overcome. The choice, for him, was clear. He decided to use his power for good, not for evil. He would use his power to help the janitor and his daughter. He remembered the doll, the drawing, and the girl's kindness, and the choice, which once seemed difficult, now seemed the only possible choice. The investigation journey had led him to a truth he never imagined would exist, a truth that forced him to confront his own demons and choose between hate and love, between revenge and compassion. He knew that the revelation of his identity was imminent, not because he wanted to, but because justice demanded it. He could no longer hide, and the truth, which he had tried so hard to keep secret, was now the only thing that could free him. The investigation journey had transformed him, from a ghost to a man, from an observer to a participant, and the emotion which he so feared was now his only compass. The pain of his past, the anger of his present, and the hope of his future mingled into a single, powerful motivation. He was no longer alone. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. The journey was a roller coaster of emotions. With each discovery, a new layer of his own pain was revealed, but with each layer, a new layer of his own strength was revealed. He was not just a student, but an heir to a legacy of kindness and sacrifice. The girl's pain, his father's kindness, the janitor's honesty, everything merged into a single and powerful story. A story he had to tell. He was no longer the poor kid. He was the son of a man who built an empire with hard work, and he was the protector of a little girl who taught him the meaning of true kindness. The investigation journey had led him to a truth he never imagined would exist, a truth that forced him to confront his own demons and choose between hate and love, between revenge and compassion. The university held a major gala event, a night when New York's elite gathered to raise funds for the university. Liam and his friends were in their element, laughing, bragging about their clothes and their cars. Ethan, wearing a simple but impeccable suit, watched everything from a distance, a solitary figure in the crowd. The music and conversations seemed like a distant buzz, and the only thing that mattered to him was the little girl and her father, whom he saw in a corner, trying to pass, unnoticed. Their pain was palpable, and Ethan's decision solidified. Suddenly, the sound of a helicopter in the sky caught everyone's attention. A strong light illuminated the facade of the building, and the sound of the blades made the conversation cease. A Blade helicopter, one of New York's most exclusive companies, landed on the building's rooftop. The crowd, previously carefree, now looked up, curious. Ethan moved toward the exit, and the crowd parted, opening a path for him. He didn't look back, but he knew Liam's eyes were on his back. He walked up the stairs one by one, his heart beating hard in his chest. The sound of his footsteps was muffled by the carpet, and with each step, he felt the armor he had worn for so long shatter into 1,000 pieces. He was not taking revenge, he was freeing himself. The rooftop door opened, and the cold New York wind hit his face. He approached the helicopter, and the pilot, in a gesture of respect, saluted. He turned to the crowd, his eyes meeting Liam's. Liam's gaze, once full of mockery, was now one of shock and disbelief. Ethan didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The helicopter, the pilot's attitude, his own posture, everything spoke for itself. He didn't need words to explain the truth. He just needed a gesture. And the gesture of walking toward the helicopter was the gesture of a man who was finally at peace with himself. He looked up at the sky, at the lights of New York that shone like stars in the dark sky. He was no longer alone. He had himself. He had the memory of his mother and father, and he had the promise of a new and unknown peace. The helicopter rose into the air, and the lights of New York became a sea of stars beneath him. Revenge, he realized, was not what he was after. What he was after was peace, and peace, he realized, was the only treasure worth possessing. The next day, a sealed envelope arrived at the dean's office. Inside, a contract that designated a generous anonymous donation to the university, with a single condition: the establishment of a scholarship fund for the children of employees, starting with the janitor's daughter. The news spread like wildfire, not because of the wealth, but because of the silent generosity of the unknown donor. Speculation about the benefactor's identity was the only conversation on campus, but the truth, Ethan knew, was what mattered. In a corner of the campus, under the shade of a tree, Ethan met with the little girl. He didn't say a word about the helicopter or the donation. Instead, he took a new teddy bear from his backpack and handed it to her. The girl smiled, and her smile was so pure, so full of light, that he felt his heart fill with a peace he had never experienced. The doll, the pain, the drawing, everything merged into a single and perfect moment of peace. As he watched her play with the teddy bear, the image of his mother, the voice of his father, Liam's laughter, everything dissipated. Only the silence and the sun reflecting on the girl's face mattered. He was no longer a ghost, he was a guardian, and true wealth, he realized, was not in his bank account, but in the heart of that little girl, a heart he had helped to heal. The humiliation, the pain, the emptiness, everything was transformed into a single and powerful emotion, the emotion of gratitude. His story, the story of pain and redemption, didn't need words, revenge, or applause. It only needed a gesture, a look. He knew that his journey had not ended, but that the peace he felt was the only treasure he wanted to protect, a treasure he found not in money, but in love, compassion, and the deepest of connections. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Have you ever lived something like this? Tell me in the comments. Your story can touch someone too. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot of beautiful stuff coming your way.